Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about the failed Palestinian experiment. Let's get started. For many of my listeners that have been with me for quite a while, it's not a surprise to you that I've talked endlessly about the idea of peace negotiations and the history of the region, and I really don't want to go over everything all over again, as much as sometimes I wish I could redo my podcasts and make them better. But this week's episode, I thought, despite going backwards, which you can go and look through our catalog and see a whole bunch of stuff on the history of the region, of peace processes and things like that, this week I want to talk specifically about the concept of the failed Palestinian experiment. Just to get some terms out of the way, because I know this sometimes becomes a little bit of an issue or sometimes even confusing. When I use the term Palestinian today, I'm referring to the people who now self-identify as Palestinians, even though, technically speaking, that was a fictional made-up nationality. People before 1964 never identified as Palestinians. Palestinians were technically the Jewish people, the Arabs and the Druze and everyone else who lived in the Palestinian region. Only after 1960s, apparently Palestinian simply meant these Arabs, but nonetheless, it was a creation. I often prefer to use the term Palestinian Arabs for that specific reason, because Palestinian Arabs were Arabs who lived in the British Mandate of Palestine. So getting all of that terminology out of the way, I apologize, I might sometimes intermingle the term Palestinian and Palestinian Arab. One incredibly smart and famous Jewish person once said, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." I can't think of a more perfect description of what's been going on in the Middle East since the 1940s, 1960s, and so on, other than insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different result is literally Middle East policy at this point. And this is why I call it the failed Palestinian experiment, because since the 1930s, 1940s, up until today, which we're going to talk about also, there has been literally an experiment to try to create a Palestinian people and give them a piece of land that they claim is theirs. That is the failed Palestinian experiment. It's been almost 80 years at this point, and it still hasn't come to fruition. So at what point do we give up on this idea? At what point does it become, okay, we tried it, it didn't work, so let's just move on to something new? And that's a little bit what I want to talk about on this episode. I really don't want to go back into our multiple episodes from our catalog. You can go back and check them out yourself, talking about all the different peace deals that Israel has tried, all the negotiations, the UN, the League of Nations, all of these people who have essentially tried the exact same thing. Split the land, give half to a certain people and half to another people, call it a day and make peace. And it's never worked. This may not come as a surprise to many of you, but the reason it's never worked is because Israel didn't accept the deal? No. It's actually the fact that Israel has accepted and offered every deal that has ever been given to them, including the original deals offered by the UN and the League of Nations that gave them a fraction of a homeland, and they accepted. The Arabs, and then eventually the Palestinians, once they were created, rejected every single deal, and that goes until today. I could spend hours reminding you of all the attempts at peace that have been made between Israel and the Arabs, and then eventually Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. We could talk about the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, all the way up until the 2000s, when Israel gave the Palestinian Arabs the Gaza Strip and then offered them 98% of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and they still rejected it. We could go over all of that, but let's just leave that aside for now and just remember the fact that the Palestinian Arabs and their leadership have, quote, never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And that was said by the American negotiating team after a negotiation was turned down by the Palestinian Arabs. But funny enough, we don't even have to really go too far into the past to see that in action. We can see it right this minute. This past week, we've had a big issue going on with the latest ceasefire deal. And for anybody who's somehow been living under a rock and doesn't realize that Israel has essentially accepted pretty much every ceasefire deal that has been offered. They have bent over backwards, and essentially the only two things that they refuse to accept is, one, the Israeli army is not going to leave Gaza because they want to continue this once the ceasefire is over to stop Hamas from coming back into power. And number two, that they need all of the hostages back. Those are the only two things Israel has said, look, we can't make a deal if that's not on the table. And Hamas openly rejects every single ceasefire that they're offered. And this is according to the people in Egypt, the people in Qatar, the people in the United States. There's no question that Israel has not been the barrier to a ceasefire. Most notably, not that long ago, Qatar actually dropped out of the ceasefire talks because they were so frustrated that Hamas wasn't even coming to the table with any intention for a legitimate ceasefire. So they just said, we're out. We don't want to be embarrassed continuously because we have no control over you. But most recently, following the death of the supposed lead negotiator, according to Hamas, we saw the Israelis yet again come back to the table for yet another ceasefire talk. We pointed out on our social media this week how ridiculous it is that Israel came to the table with all of the third parties and Hamas refused to show up. And yet they still had these ceasefire talks. I don't exactly know how ceasefire talks work when the one group doesn't even show up to the table. I pointed out that Israel's kind of just negotiating with itself, where everyone else in the third parties are saying, hey, can you do this? What about doing this? Why don't we do this? But there's nothing in return. They're just essentially negotiating against themselves. But nonetheless, Israel showed up, and they apparently came to an agreement. At the end of the talks that took over 2-3 days, Israel agreed to another ceasefire. That's probably about 10 or 15 at this point. The negotiators, along with the United States and Europe, were all so excited to say that we have, quote, never been closer to a ceasefire deal until now. Ironically, Hamas never even showed up, but apparently everybody was very hopeful. That was until today, when the negotiators brought the apparently agreed to terms by Israel and the third parties to Hamas. And what did Hamas say? Hamas responded by saying, quote, Netanyahu doesn't want a real deal, so we don't accept. So they turned down yet another ceasefire for apparently no reason. Israel agreed to the ceasefire. The only two things that Israel has said is that they don't want to leave the Gaza Strip. They'll pull back, but they're not leaving. And it will not be a permanent ceasefire because they need to be able to come back and ensure Hamas is gone. And they need their hostages back. And apparently that is something that Hamas won't do. The ceasefire negotiations is like a microcosm for the whole Palestinian Arab peace talk situation. They cannot and will not ever make peace with the Israelis or a ceasefire deal because their desires are essentially impossible. When it comes to peace, the peace negotiation requires river to the sea, Israel to literally not exist anymore. I think that might be a no-go for the Israelis. I hate to say I'm not a negotiator, but they may not agree to literally just all pack up and leave to somewhere. And when it comes to ceasefires, essentially what Hamas is saying is, we might give you back your people if you take all of your guys and leave us alone so we can rebuild and allow us to continue running so we can do another October 7th, which we have very clearly said we want to do. So that's a no-go for Israel also. So when it comes to ceasefire talks, the irony in the fact that the world keeps trying to bring these two sides together, trying to get a ceasefire talk, even when Hamas doesn't even show up, what are we doing here? This is literally insanity. I mean, I don't know the details of the minor changes that Israel is eventually negotiating against itself because Hamas isn't even there, but expecting something different from these people who literally always want the same thing, which is to survive and then continue terrorizing Israel. That's never going to be an agreement. There's no negotiation on that. And yet the world tries to pretend like this is reasonable, I guess. Or maybe there's a middle ground here we could find. I'm not sure if it's really safe to say that at this point, the Palestinian Arabs as a people, as hopefully having their own piece of land, their own country, their own government, has gone out the window. It is a failed experiment. We offered them Gaza Strip. They screwed it up and turned it into a terror hotbed. We offered them the West Bank with hopes of eventually giving them their own state. It is also a hotbed for terrorism and more corruption than I can even explain. The 20 years of being unelected that the Palestinian Authority is paying terrorists to kill Israelis with government money? I mean, what else do we need to know? It is a failed experiment. I have talked about the Oslo Accords before. This was the greatest hope for a Palestinian state in history, really. The idea that they were going to get autonomy in Area A, and they were going to have semi-autonomy in Area B, and then eventually have a final border that is safe and open between the two countries that will allow them to live in peace once and for all. That was 30 years ago. 30 years ago. And nothing has moved, nothing has changed. Things have only gotten worse. It was supposed to bring safety and security to both sides, and yet terrorism is on the rise. Hamas is becoming more and more powerful within Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian Authority area. So again, at what point do we just admit that this failed? It didn't work. And do we have to stick with this plan? The Oslo Accords were intended to make things safer. If the Palestinian Authority is not holding up its part of the deal and it is not stopping terrorism from its own area, then should we go back to before the Oslo Accords? Should we roll them back and decide that Israel should go back into Area A and B and take full control? It's not ideal, but to be honest with you, what's the other option? If they are not holding up their end of the bargain, why do they expect Israel to hold up its end of the bargain? And nothing is more obvious when it comes to this issue than what the news is recently calling, quote, settler violence. And I want to talk about that because it's infuriating how many times I hear that on the news. The mainstream media talks about it constantly. Quote, settler violence in, quote, occupied Palestinian territories. This couldn't be more biased if they tried. The term settler, which I talked about in one of our previous podcasts, is a very loaded term. Settler essentially just means Israelis in an area that the Palestinian Arabs and their supporters, along with their media supporters, decided was Palestinian land, even though, under the Oslo Accords, it is not Palestinian land, and frankly has never been Palestinian land. It was Jordanian, and it was British, and it was Israeli. But for some reason, when Jews were there, they're settlers. It's funny how they love the Oslo Accords when it gives the Palestinian Arabs their own government and police and so on and so on. But they don't like it when they have to accept that Area C is actually Jewish land and gives the Jews the right to be there. Apparently it's still illegal, even though the Palestinians have agreed to give it to the Israelis. We've talked about the media bias on this podcast many times, but very clearly when we talk about quote-unquote settler violence, where I saw CNN and all these other organizations talking about the poor people of the West Bank and the occupied territories getting settler violence, setting cars on fire and beating people up, and how terrible it was. They are so afraid, these poor Arabs that are living in the West Bank, yada, yada, yada. We've heard it endlessly. What they're not telling you, which is very common, is the fact that it kind of goes both ways. And I don't support it, for the record. But we hear about these poor Palestinians. Look at how these Israeli, quote, settlers are just destroying their towns, burning their cars, burning their houses. This is awful. Why are they doing this? They're just heartless, terrible people. And that's a pretty easy conclusion to come to if you only get half the story. What you're not told about is the daily violence by Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, against Jewish people. This can be anything from a poor Israeli man who accidentally made the wrong turn and ended up in Area A, which is run by the Palestinian Authority, who was murdered and his car with him inside was set on fire. That was a little while ago. But just today I read that a 40-year-old Israeli who was in Area C of his own home, where he's allowed to be, was killed by a Palestinian Arab using a hammer. He was beaten to death. The media will not tell you about this. The media doesn't tell you about the daily rock throwing at people in Judea and Samaria, the daily shootings that happen because The Palestinian Arabs and the Jews in the West Bank Area C share the same roads. So therefore, you're waiting at a stoplight and someone decides to pull out a gun and shoot you and kill an entire family, which also happened recently, a mother and her kids. No one talks about this on the news. So therefore, when you see that the quote-unquote settlers, or the Israelis, are going into an Arab village in the West Bank and setting fire to cars and beating people up and so on, you can now understand why it's happening. Not that I condone it, but it's definitely not just a random event of violence of these Israeli people going and beating up Arabs for the fun of it. Again, I absolutely do not condone violence on any side. Israelis should be better than that. The problem is, I could also understand how if the Israeli government is not really supporting the people in Area C as they should, and people are being shot on the streets, people are being murdered in their homes, so on, I can understand the frustration that happens because no one's protecting them. They want to protect themselves. It is still absolutely wrong. And the funny thing is, again, the news won't tell you this, the Israeli government has officially said that they do not condone these actions. It was wrong. Immediately after this happened, they took the IDF and went out into the area and stopped a future attack from happening. They 100% were against it, which is what you would expect from a normal government. What you never hear is the Palestinian Authority coming out and telling their people to stop shooting families waiting at a red light or beating someone to death with a hammer. You will never hear them condemning it and saying that this is not right and you shouldn't do this. That's the difference. On the one hand, you have the Israeli government who doesn't condone these actions and tries to stop it as best as they can. It's difficult to stop random acts of violence, no matter who they are. And on the other hand, you've got the Palestinian Authority, whose job under the Oslo Accord was to maintain safety and security in the area, won't even condone the actions of terrorists. And not only that, they do what's known as pay for slay, meaning that guy with the hammer gets a paycheck for the rest of his life. And if he's killed, his family will get a paycheck for the rest of their lives. The two sides could not be more clear. Which one supports terror and which one is against acts of terror. In the end, it is extremely clear that this Palestinian experiment where we created a people, where we offered them land, where we offered them coexistence, where we offered them their own government, and so on, has not worked. It has failed. Even a ceasefire, temporary as it may be, will be broken by the Hamas terrorists, like the 6 or 7 other ceasefires that they've already broken. Why the entire world considers this idea of peace talks and ceasefire talks with terrorist organizations who won't even call out their own terror and say they'll do it again is beyond me. It is the definition of insanity. We have to do something different. Clearly, it is not working. So what that different thing is, I don't know. Do we go back to pre-Oslo situation where Israel controls the entire area of Judea and Samaria and Gaza? Or maybe we need to go extreme. And I've heard some people make the claim that this failed experiment has gone on far too long and that maybe we need to try something drastic. Peace deals have not worked. Ceasefires have not worked. Maybe the only real solution is by forcing those people who live in Judea and Samaria illegally, according to pretty much all the history, who have refused to make peace and a deal that will allow them to stay and have their own state. They've lost their chance. Sorry, it's a failed experiment. Didn't work. Let's try something new. Maybe expect the UN to go and find a place for them. Maybe tell the UN to pick them all up in a plane and drop them off wherever you want because they no longer belong here. I really don't know the answer. But what I do know is that clearly the current situation cannot continue for another 100 years. We cannot continue to have Israelis living in fear of terrorism on a daily basis because the Palestinian Arabs refuse to make peace. How much longer are we going to allow this failed experiment to continue? And at what cost? To everybody on both sides. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.